You're talking a little bit off camera about the value of the college degree and how that might be changing over time. The value being not just in the formal education, but to the commitment to something over the 4 year span. And it reminds me of one of those like sort of cultural rumors I always heard where it was like, if you're a young guy, if you're advancing in a job after a certain point, you must be married by a certain point. Otherwise, they've mentally xed you out because this guy could bounce at any time. You could get an opportunity and jump and run. Whereas the guy with the mortgage and the family, um, it's a little bit harder for him to say, "Hey, I'm just gonna blow up my role today and go, chop wood in the forest," which is something I saw on Instagram earlier today. But it's interesting to see how many things would just end up being like proxies and selection biases for sort of other attributes.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've heard that sort of like, I don't know if we'd call it a rumor or a folk tale, but I struggle to believe that there's not at least some truth to that, in my
Yeah,
opinion. Maybe not in the modern age, but throughout history, like I believe, maybe in the 1950s that there was a broad cultural idea that by a certain age, a man must have a family. Otherwise, this proves that he lacks, I don't know, some sort of foundation or stability.
yeah,
But I think that's I think, I mean, I'm totally speculating right now. I sort of think that's probably a little bit less relevance today because I don't think companies really expect employees to like have a lifelong commitment anymore.
yeah.
I think if you stay at a company for 3 to 5 years, that's usually a pretty successful
That's
tenure, you know. Unless, obviously people could stay longer than that, move up the chain, that's great, but I think, the whole job hopping trend of younger
yeah,
generations has sort of changed what both employees and employers expect. And I think that the university landscape is probably adjusting to that as well, insofar as, teaching students a range of different skills so that they can jump to different sectors, perhaps be a generalist rather than
mhm.
a specialist.
Yeah. I was. I mentioned Instagram a moment ago. I was thinking about something I saw the other day. There was a young guy on there from the UK. He says, "Hey guys, come and follow me in my dying trade. This is my trade. It's not that popular anymore. It's a dying trade." He was a stone dresser. This guy, he takes a stone, he's beating at a rock, he's shaping it every different way. He's working in quarries and construction sites and such. And I thought, huh, what an interesting look into something that is sort of losing relevance, losing prevalence as a skill, even in this vastly different context. And I thought about our interview today, and you're a speech and debate coach, and we could in a sense say that speech, debate, discourse, it is somewhat degrading in skill. And it's interesting that you took on the role so young. How old are you, by the way?
31.
31. Okay, so you were a speech and debate coach from how long to how long, and a college professor for how long to how long. Just want to establish
Um,
that up front.
I got into coaching, honestly, before I'd even graduated undergrad. I was
Mm,
a competitor on the GMU debate team. I want to say I started around uh, 2013, 2014 academic year. I didn't graduate until 2018, but before my last year of college, I actually didn't compete, even though I was still eligible, and I just became a full-time coach for the team.
mm,
For a lot of different reasons, like the whole competitive atmosphere of debate was a little bit too draining on me, but the thing that kept me in the activity was really investing in my teammates. I became someone who was more invested in the success of others than myself. And I found that I had a real knack for helping people overcome the mental and structural barriers of debate to go from, people that would struggle earlier in their career to becoming very, very skilled debaters toward the end of their career. And I think, I can't take all the credit for it, but I think I'm very proud of the fact that they credit me in many cases for their success. So that told me, okay, maybe there's something here. Maybe I have a talent here that not everybody has, or I have a way of thinking about this that perhaps needs to be spread. So that got me into coaching. So I'd say around 2018, I became a coach. Then after I graduated, I was given the opportunity to become an assistant coach at James Madison University, where I also pursued my master's degree.
mm.
So I was still a student, but then at this time, I'm like fully into the coaching role, not just a thing I'm doing, is, a side hobby. I'm getting paid for it now, at least, at the very least, you know. So while a master's student, I'm coaching debate, and that's a lot of my best success came from there. I really connected with the students, and you know, just a fact, the most successful season in the competitive history of the JMU debate team was my second year there as an assistant
Excellent.
coach. The one,
Excellent stuff.
James Madison University has existed for a long time. That school has existed since the 1800s. I think like 1880 something was when the school was founded, and its best competitive season. I am very proud of that accomplishment.
That is definitely something to hang your hat on. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Money and Breakfast podcast. This is my guest, Ian Lowery, academic and speech and debate orator. We're going to get into a wide variety of topics today. But one of the things I want to stay on this topic for a little bit is just that age,
Mhm.
that age, that age aspect of things. You come in very young to come in as a student, but also to come in as somebody who has to uh, sort of mold people along this skill-based track. I mean, how did you balance sort of exercising authority with also, sort of establishing that rapport of being able to, really cultivate that team environment?
Yeah, that was tough
And I'd
for
like to
me.
know about that in the classroom as well, because that's a very interesting aspect.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap there. I don't see a lot of distinction between my role as a coach in debate versus my role as an instructor in a classroom. There are clear differences, of course, like, traveling to competitions versus just seeing students maybe 2 or 3 times a week. But ultimately, I think that my role in both, uh roles was to provide an experience for my students, to
Mm.
give them something that they can remember that teaches them lessons. I'm a big fan of, film and television media. I know that you are as well.
Of
So
course.
I think about things thematically, the same way that movies, over the course of a 2-ish hour experience, it imparts themes upon the viewer to teach them about what is right and wrong, where characters, made the correct or the incorrect decision, and how that led to an outcome. I almost think about teaching in a very similar way, and coaching. It's about creating experiences where students get to experience those things, where they have the autonomy to make the right or the wrong choice, but then hoping that in doing that, an outcome that is commensurate with that will be revealed. So just like in debate, or actually, let me rewind to your question about authority, because I think that's what brings me on this track, because I've always had a complex relationship with authority. It's never really been something that I felt comfortable exercising.
Mm.
And that's partly due to my age, but also I just think because of my history with education. When I was young, I grew up in the South in Mississippi. Um, I went to a school that had corporal punishment.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, so the literally instructors would walk around, they'd slap you with a stick if you got a question wrong. Not even if you misbehaved, just like answering a question wrong, and you'd get hit for it. And like, people had it way worse when they were young, but that gave me a very interesting relationship with education, to where like I don't want to be like that. I
Mhm.
don't want to be someone that always has a carrot and stick mentality when it comes to helping other people, but particularly students who are younger than me, um, reach a particular outcome that I want from them. So instead, I want them to be themselves, to express themselves, but at the same time, there is a level of my hand trying to guide them toward the outcomes that will make them better people, better students, better learners, all of those things. I hope that answered your question.
No, that's fantastic. No, definitely fantastic. And tangents are welcome here on the Money and Breakfast podcast. But I do, 2018 is a really, really interesting time to start doing anything because, the
Mm,
elephant in the room, which is COVID being around the corner. But not just COVID, we sort of have the hindsight now to look back and see the burgeoning the burgeoning sort of emergence of AI, it as being a more commonplace tool used in classrooms, used in used in academics, used in the professional world, used in industry. I mean, I'm seeing people lose their law licenses,
mhm.
lose their medical licenses, take things to court that are, complete hogwash, because of an over reliance on AI. Tell me a little bit about how you saw things develop over time, how you saw things change over time while you were there, as far as just, the reaction to COVID, distance learning and such, but then being, quite frankly, smacked in the face on the other end with this extremely powerful technology.
Yeah, I mean, I think in both there's so much to say and so little to say, because I think with COVID, as you mentioned, distance learning became the norm.
Mhm.
And I think immediately in my role as a, graduate teaching assistant, led to JMU shifting to entirely virtual for my first semester there, which, you know, was a transition, but ultimately, I can't say that it had that much of an effect. But where it did have an effect is the next year and the year after that, as we had new classes of incoming undergraduate freshmen,
Mhm.
you could really see a steep decline in their social acumen, in their attention span in the classroom, in their ability to complete projects without very heavy handed guidance. And for the next three 3 to 4 years, I would say it almost like got worse and worse. I'm like,
Mm.
oh, I can see from a younger age, like this is a person that was a sophomore in high school when COVID happened. So that
Oh,
means that's like, 3 years of distance learning where they didn't get that in-person experience of getting to talk to other students, getting to work with an instructor one-on-one in the classroom. So that was a big challenge. But I think almost the exact same thing is occurring with AI right now, where it's a little bit different because it's not necessarily about the physical distance, but AI is creating a distance between um, the level of intellectual rigor that a
mhm.
student has to invest in their assignments or whatever it is that they're working on and achieving a particular outcome. I just imagine, like, I really feel, I don't want to say feel bad. It's not necessarily about pity, but students that are, young, maybe middle schoolers, young high schoolers right now that are learning that, oh, go, I can just like type a prompt into Chat GPT and it'll like deliver a reasonably high quality outcome. Like maybe not perfect, but it's probably better. And for the level of time committed, better than what they could produce on their own. Right. And there's like some truth to that. But it also creates a level of separation between, when you work hard on something yourself and you overcome those mental barriers and challenges yourself. And then you produce something and maybe it gets like a B plus, maybe a B. You can
If
still feel a little bit proud of that, but
if C's get degrees, then B's definitely do.
yeah, absolutely. But instead, it's creating a situation in which you're outsourcing that. You're
Mhm.
outsourcing that rigor. You're outsourcing that ability to overcome mental blocks. And it produces work that comes out faster. It produces maybe work that, we can argue about whether or not it, in all instances, is better or worse than what a human could produce. I mean, it's to some degree, AI probably can produce things that are better than what a high school freshman could produce, writing wise. But as you continue to develop, though, you get into higher levels like college, graduate school, like, completely falls off where,
Yeah,
you
the nuances start to matter more.
for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
So it's interesting because because on top of COVID and on top of AI, as if those two weren't already massive, you were teaching in the academic sphere and also coaching debate during an extremely politically polarized time. And I remember going into grad school myself. Of course, you know, take the real world for what the real world is. Hopefully, don't glean one's experiences from online. But I remember thinking, I don't necessarily know what I might see or what how certain conversations might go in class. I remember one situation that was pretty interesting. It was comparative policy process class, and we're having a conversation obviously about the comparative policy process in different nations. And we get to some global South nations, some critiques of America, American intervention, American overseas adventures, economic shenanigans, you know, political, again, political sort of charades. These sort of things come up, right? Some critiques start to fly from some students in my class. Well, America has done this. America has prevented this sort of situation, this nation, this situation from improving, and then a guy speaks up. This is military guy, military guy, military veteran, still currently in the military, and he points out, hey, understand totally what people are saying, but this is not the entire story of America. Here we can name all these sort of situations where America has done good, where American involvement has been for the best possible outcome. And I'll admit my expectation at the time was like, oh man, here we go. They're gonna yell at him. And then these other 3 veterans that are in the class are gonna go on this guy's side, and then they're gonna call this guy racist, and it's just, the whole class is shot, is what I thought was about to happen. And what actually happened is that all those people who were, like, lobbing those critiques after that guy said, "Hey, think about nuance," they were like, "Yeah, that's true. That's it. Yeah, that's a good point. It was very, very it was very, very respectful, actually quite productive. We were able to have a good class and good discourse after that, but that's not necessarily the way things could have gone. Tell me a little bit about, both teaching and coaching, during a divisive time, during a time where many, many polarized topics, especially, because of social media, certain taboos are boiling to the top now, and there's not, a polite, the auspices of of maintaining polite conversation won't save us from, again, certain things coming into the public discourse.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that necessarily the timing of where politics is in a given moment actually doesn't have that much of a profound effect on the sorts of discourse that you see in policy debate. But the reason for that, though, is because debate, policy debate was the style of debate that I did. There are various styles that we could go into, but by its very nature, debate is always supposed to be controversial
Mm,
and politically polarizing. The resolution or the topic for each year of debate is designed to be a topic that has sort of a political salience in current events,
mm,
while at the same time being something that is robust enough to have a sufficient amount of ground on both sides of whether you're affirming or negating that topic. So from the very start of my journey in debate, this was what did I say, about 2014, so a few years before, say, Trump's first election.
mm.
The first topic that I debated on was a domestic policy topic of whether or not the United States federal government should legalize the sale of marijuana, which, this is before Colorado and all these things. Like, this was still a pretty hot button topic.
This is breakfast table
But
conversation
yeah,
these days.
but not just that. This was what was called a list topic. So you could choose whether or not you wanted to legalize marijuana, online gambling, which
Okay.
I'm like today, but at the time it was interesting. Online gambling, physician-assisted suicide. What else was there? Again, physician-assisted suicide. All right, there were 2 more, but those are the 3 that are coming to mind right now, right? And those created very interesting discussions, right?
Mm,
And especially when you're imagining, like, these are college undergraduates that are being put into a room together and forced to say, like, hey, have discourse on this, politically controversial issue,
mm.
right? Things get heated. Things would blow up. That worst case scenario that you just described of, like, hey, people are going to start getting called racist. People are going to yell, I've seen that happen so many times. That's almost my comfort zone. I live in that space, right? And even though that can be destructive, and probably is destructive in most cases, I think there's a pedagogical or educational value that can exist within that sort of extremely heated uh, just discourse on a very complex issue, right? It requires effective facilitation, though. You can't just let people run wild and because then the whole conversation breaks down. But as someone who considered, I was a debate professional to some degree, still am because I'm still involved. I really want to push back against what I think is a social atmosphere that thinks about debate and argumentation as something that necessarily should be avoided in a lot of instances. Even, when those conversations are uncomfortable, even when they're very tense and maybe they're even hurtful in some cases for people, I think that there need to be times where we lean into that instead of saying, okay, well, let's just go about this, in the least provocative, most civil way. Right? Because there's benefit to that. Those can be very productive conversations too. But those are very different kinds of conversations
Mm.
than the, very adversarial type of discussions that you have in a very heated debate.
Yeah, there are definitely nuances to be detected there, and I think it is that fear. It's interesting. You want to. There seems to be the desire to preserve civility, while also just protecting the discourse against the bad faith. But the bad faith is just inherently it is something that exists
Yeah.
the way that any sort of bad thing exists. But I'd like to talk about the skill set a little bit more. What would you say as far as skill set were the major things you tried to impart in your in the people you coached, in your students as you taught them, and also even if we were to widen out the topic of the appeal of debate, what would be the selling point for someone, anybody of any age, picking up and saying, "I'd like to do debate casually, in a team atmosphere," because this is one of those things I think is lifelong.
Yeah, absolutely. The number one thing by far, the thing that whenever someone is even moderately interested in debate, what's the first thing that they say? Public speaking. They
Mm,
want to develop their skill to speak in front of an audience, to speak clearly and confidently, and any style of debate, whatever you choose to do, certainly imparts that. I think the less spoken about, slightly more underrated skill, but I would say is equally as important, if not more important, is I think debate trains your information processing ability to be far greater than that of the average person. I mean, you can certainly reach the similar level of skill outside of doing any sort of debate, but debate really creates an incentive for you to expand your mind's ability to take in different information from different sources of information, from different perspectives, and really synthesize it in a very short amount of time to where you then use that public speaking skill to, you know, return whatever it is that you just ingested into, something that is consumable for your audience,
mm.
accessible for your audience. So I would say to me, that is the number one takeaway from debate. But me personally, just to tell you a little bit about my background, when I first got started in debate, or before I got started in debate, rather, I had severe public speaking anxiety. I
Mm.
couldn't speak in front of even interpersonal conversations, like something one on one was very difficult for me. And the first time I ever gave a debate speech, this was not in an actual competition or in front of an audience. This was just for one of my coaches at the time, just in our office. We had our own office for the debate team. It was just me and my coach in the office, and she just hands me a script and she's like, "Hey, just read this. Let me hear what you sound like." And as I get into this speech, I start crying because I'm so uncomfortable in that moment.
Interesting.
Yeah, so, like, I couldn't handle it, and, that was a thing that happened throughout my life, just, like, whenever I'm put on the spot, whenever I have people watching me, whether it's one person or a group of people, oh, God forbid it be a group of people, but it just wouldn't end well, but debate, allowed just through systematic desensitization. It wasn't anything special, but just through doing it over and over again, you get more comfortable, you get those little bits of affirmation here and there that help you say, it's like, "Okay, this is okay. I'm good at this, or even if I'm not good at this, it's not the end of the world, you know?"
So, one of the reasons that I thought it was really important, and I appreciate that answer, but one of the reasons I thought it was really important to not just to speak to an academic and also speak to a debater, but to speak to somebody who is both those things and is also on the younger side, is that you can often speak the direct cultural language of a lot of your students. And a lot of what we were talking about before we got on camera was the enrollment cliff, as you put it. Now, I want you to highlight for us what that is, and then let's go into a little bit more of we'll dive a little bit deeper from there.
Yeah. So the enrollment cliff is sort of I suppose we could call it a theory, even though we are starting to see it be validated and play out a little bit as, data comes out about college enrollments from the last academic year and this academic year. But it is sort of this notion that as we see a cultural shift, particularly in the younger generation, away from being interested in higher education, away from seeing any value or prestige in obtaining a college degree, that there's going to be a very steep decline in undergraduate enrollment in universities across the board, right? And it poses a very serious challenge to universities that they are already creating multi-year plans to address in their, like, board meetings, or for with the presidents.
So, one of the reasons I bring that up is I was, and you know this from being on the debate side of things. I know this from just the public policy space. Sometimes gets a little uncomfortable. you have to get into the mud a little bit. You see a conversation where you monitor the discourse to see how the conversation is developing. And one of the things I want to hit on in what you just said with the enrollment cliff is the prestige aspect, the status aspect. I remember eavesdropping on a thread on eavesdropping on a thread on Twitter. And what was going on was that it's a lot. It was a lot of complaints about the current job market, salaries, affordability, the economic prospects of people being able to move up. Now, this guy, though, one commentator works at a think tank. He says, "Hey, you guys are vastly overblowing, the economic situation. Things are fine." He said, they're talking about, the credentials necessary to make what they would believe to be a comfortable salary. And he says, "Hey, look, here's something from my area. You can go, you can manage. I believe it was like a Panda Express manager. It was like something in the realm of 70 to 90K. He's like, you don't even need a college degree for this. You're fine." And obviously the comments blew up at him, "Oh, well, I don't want to work at no effing Panda Express and all that." But two things, very, 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 very heated thread. But two things that stood out was one guy pointed out, he says, number one, the prestige aspect of even if the salary is there, the prestige of what the actual role was and the perceived status of that. And number two, the one I found even more interesting because this commentator connected it not just to this argument, but also to the, hey, college isn't working, go get a trade sort of realm of advice. He says, a lot of older people seem to be telling certain younger people this so that they can disconnect them from institutional power in the sense that like you can, one might become a plumber or an electrician and become very, very successful, make a lot of money, but the direct pathways to institutional power are not necessarily there for the same guy, the same way they are for the guy who worked on the Hill for 5 years, who was in a think tank for 3 or 4, knew the right guy, who worked at a lobbying shop. I'd like to get your commentary on, the status aspect, the prestige aspect, and then that institutional aspect as far as where does this all fit in the calculus of a young person deciding to go to college,
Yeah,
in your opinion?
yeah, definitely. I think that this goes to a bit of what we mentioned. I forget if we talked about this before we were on air or not, but in this idea of colleges being, mechanisms or a vehicle to get a job, but not necessarily about achieving any sort of higher learning or level of, intellectual strength. I think, when we think about when we think about colleges through that lens of like this is just a place where you spend 4 years to get a degree as a vehicle to get a job. We have to stop and remind ourselves like what kind of job does college train students to achieve? Generally white collar,
Mhm.
some exceptions like they're teaching students to come become a part of this institution for 4 years. You will graduate and then you will get a white collar job. Like that is sort of that's the prestige element of it. White collar jobs. There's
I can join this institution. Perhaps there's prestige in here once I'm working the white collar job and I move up. No, I see what.
yeah, exactly. So it's almost like a recreation of the exact same dichotomy though between the idea of the blue collar working class versus the idea of like rising above that to some sort of like
Above.
new level where you do work that is less rigorous but you get paid a lot more because through some calculus you are deemed more productive
Mhm.
because you sit at a laptop and crunch numbers instead of use a screwdriver or something. So I think for a very long time the prestige generally behind higher education has been exactly that of like it is a pathway to surpass becoming the McDonald's worker, to surpass the plumber, to surpass various blue collar fields. But we see the whole idea behind the enrollment cliff that we mentioned is we see in the modern day like that doesn't play out the same way anymore. Like you
Mhm.
can actually make a lot of money in blue collar professions these
Yeah,
days,
yeah.
like quite a bit more than you could make at most entry level jobs that you would get out of college, white collar or not. So I think that's sort of like the underlying uh, mythos that created the prestige behind college that we are seeing slowly erode today.
Mhm. Tell me a little bit more about the courses that you in particular taught, and again, the age aspect is so interesting because you are young enough to be, of course, a lot of us are still connected with old professors or colleagues or such, but you're old enough to be, or you're young enough rather, to be connected with your students on more so the peer-to-peer level, while still maintaining the gravitas of somebody who was a professor, an authority figure. Tell me a little bit more about, just sort of where these people land as far as your old, your old debate team participants, and what those skills lend themselves to now in their real lives. But I definitely want to know about those courses as well.
Yeah, yeah. So my classroom teaching or courses that I've instructed, um, largely introduction to public speaking, like at both JMU and GMU.
Mm,
I sort of specialized in sort of the gen ed intro to public speaking courses.
mm.
In addition to that, I taught argumentation and public policy as a
Oh,
specialized course at George Mason University. Yeah, public policy. I know that stuck out to you, as well as introduction to debate theory and practice was also
mhm.
a specialized course that I was allowed to teach, given my background in argumentation.
See, it reminds me of one of those things where you get the practicum of what the thing is, and then the theory and history behind it. I imagine you guys went through the Socratic method, broke it down. Why is this productive? Why do we do this? But tell me a little bit more about any sort of personal spins you put on those things, because you know, I hear those course titles. It's hard it's hard for me to listen to those and say, oh yeah, there's one sort of one size fits all curriculum
Yeah,
that would
no,
that would make sense for these. So tell me a little bit more about the spin you would put on those.
yeah, absolutely not. So, when it comes to the basic course, as we call it, or those introduction to communication studies, introduction to public speaking, the course title got reworked a couple times of it. But um, so I would say it varies by institution. So at James Madison University, their basic course was much more communication theory
Mhm.
focused. So exactly like I said, the Socratic method, various the different tenets of ethos, pathos, logos,
Mm.
various like even more modern communication theories of like interpersonal communication theory, group communication theory. And I enjoyed that as someone who was beginning their journey as a communication scholar, even though was a part of debate, which is housed in the communication department at GMU. I was an econ guy, so that was sort of that nice little mix between, these sort of um, what's the humanities and sort of like a more rigorous science, but I was more so on the number crunching kind of element of like,
Mm.
okay, supply demand curve go woo or something like that. So as I was beginning to actually dive into communication theory, teaching that course actually, gave me a great foundation to work on because like, okay, I have to learn these fundamentals so I can teach it to
Mm.
my students. Moving to GMU, their basic course from the time I got there was far more interested in sort of the more practical public speaking side of
Mhm.
things. So the course was designed around students giving 3 speeches over the course of the semester, and a lot of the classes were more uh, focused on giving students time to practice their speeches. You might talk a little bit about how to inflect your voice.
Mm.
We'll talk a little bit about gestures, movements, those things. So less theory and far more practice as I moved to GMU. And for both my argumentation and public policy class as well as the debate theory and practice class, I loved it because I had so much autonomy there.
Mm.
In the other classes, I had a bit of wiggle room to do my thing, but as they were basic courses in gen ed, there needs to
Yeah,
be
you gotta
a
set the
level of
table.
standardization, right? Because I'm teaching this class, but then so are like 50 other instructors. So,
Mm.
there's only so much I can do to change it. Otherwise, it becomes unfair. Um, so for the classes where I had a little bit more autonomy to dictate the curriculum and teach what I wanted to teach, it was all over. I wanted to have a very rigorous theoretical component of the class, but
Mm.
also, as I mentioned before, I really wanted to impart on my students like you need to do things with these skills that you're getting. Um, so I think particularly that debate theory and practice class, I sort of built my curriculum around this idea that the same way, say, a musician
Mhm.
creates music with their instruments, a debater uh, creates something through their instrument, which is ethos, pathos, and logos.
Right.
We use these tenets of logic and appeals to emotion and appeals to credibility to create something from nothing, or to expand something that was once small to make it great. So in doing that, it was largely focused upon practical examples of like, hey, here are controversial issues that are happening today. Let's unpack these things together. Let's try to get into those nuances and see what insights we can draw. To it's not necessarily about even challenging their opinions on something, but I want to equip you with the skills to be able to explain your opinion on something. All right, just one quick example.
Of
So
course.
this one way that I introduce these ideas in my class are I would begin the class. I would say, we all understand that, we exist in a rules based order, both, domestically and in the society we live in, also hopefully
It's good
internationally.
to say that in speech and debate class and not political science class.
Okay,
But
I'm sure. I'm sure. But I would say, like, let's take something simple like a game of rock, paper, scissors. We play rock, paper, scissors. We both throw at the same time. I switch my answer after, I see your answer and I say I win. Why can't I do that? And, students would say, "Oh, well, because that's against the rules." And I say, "So what? Why does that matter?" Right? And what I'm getting at is I'm trying to lead them to like, okay, like we, have all been conditioned to just sort of like accept standard principles of fairness, standard
Mm.
principles of, obeying certain norms or, adhering to certain norms. But one thing, and this sort of is more about debate rather than the class itself, but one thing that you learn is in collegiate debate, there sort of are no rules.
Mm.
The former director while I was at JMU, the director of debate, he had a very memorable phrase to me. I sort of repeat. He says, "Debate is sort of the Wild West of social interaction."
Interesting.
And what he meant by that is essentially everything in debate is debatable. Questions like even whether or not you have to obey the rules is debatable. And whenever I tell someone outside debate that just like blows their mind. Like, what do you mean? There are no rules in this activity.
You'd think it'd be the opposite, like outside looking in.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes to those different styles that I mentioned before. Like some styles, there are sort of like a greater expectation that judges will enforce certain norms. But this debate is different than like basketball or football, where okay, people obeying the same rules, like someone could get hurt, right?
Yeah.
But in debate, it's all just like discourse. Like no one's going to leave the debate injured. So in terms of are we playing the same game right now? Do I have to follow your expected rules or your expected way in which I will engage in this debate? These are all things that are up for discussion, and we have 2 hours to sit in a room and discuss whether or not that's a way in which we should engage with this time.
I'm glad you have this alongside I'll say shout out to the generalists alongside alongside an appreciation for a generalist because even while I was in school I tried to understand even if I wasn't deep into a policy field, I try to understand the basics, the brass tacks, the rules, so to speak, of how that piece worked. Now, I was an economics guy as well. I was also big on the emerging technology side as far as how do we develop use cases for these things, and how do we, and a big part of that is on the implementation side. Okay, well, how do we communicate with the use case that we are doing? How do we gain that buy-in? For this use case, this policy, this sort of initiative, whatever it might be, and it's interesting to I don't know. It's interesting, almost ironic to hear somebody, you were on the economic side, you were getting onto the brass tacks economically. You also spent a lot of time, conceiving of how to communicate correctly, of how to push forth arguments. And then, one of the biggest, it's one of the biggest, I guess, political questions today is how do we, how do you message on economics effectively, given that it can be opaque. There's many different. You could turn a corner and end up down, a completely different subsection of it, and it's not something where it's like, we all learn how to read, we all learn how to count. We don't all learn again like you said, the supply and demand curve or anything like that. Tell me a little bit about economics. Did that economic side and that messaging side, that sort of I guess they're both humanities, but
Mhm.
getting one skews a little bit more towards the quantitative and the other towards the qualitative.
Yeah, and that's something I still struggle with today. Like it's especially as you mentioned, the opacity within economics. It's not something where you can almost ever really make a hard decision or a hard definitive claim that X led to Y, which led to Z,
Mm,
because there are so many confounding variables. So, in debate, questions of economics come up all the time, of course, about the economic consequences of any policy, if you're on the negative. And that's a go-to strategy, right? And it looks like presenting just a lot of these different indicators of, like questions of employment, like whether we see empirically a certain policy leading to higher or greater unemployment if it was implemented at a state level or internationally. Questions of GDP, of course,
yeah.
to whatever degree that can be an indicator of overall social wellness. Even things like not the stock market, but business confidence.
Mm,
So it's almost just like throwing at your opponent these various indicators, and in response, they will have their own indicators to say, like, no, actually, universal healthcare would be fantastic because
yeah.
here's a study that says that actually it would increase in the long run, like overall, like business productivity because workers are less sick or something like that. So it's almost within that ambiguity, relying more so on your own skill as a communicator to convey to a judge or whoever your audience is why whichever indicators happen to fall on your side of the issue are actually the ones that are more important to emphasize, or perhaps a better um, predictor of
Mm.
a certain outcome. But it's something that there is no science to that by any means when it comes to economic issues. It's just sort of please, please just agree that, whatever statistics or studies I have on my side of the issue are important.
Please look at this chart and notice
Exactly.
and
Please look at the
note
graph.
please
The
note the
graph, it's
colors.
going down. It's going down, Judge. Look at the graph.
Please note the colors and the direction of the line. It's interesting because you know I tell frankly anybody who anybody who listen, I've been fencing for a little while, right? And one of the there's a straightforward lot. There's rules. There's a straightforward logic to what we're doing, but there's also very fast moving blades and a human ref
Mhm.
that has to interpret what happened along with the electrical lights that shows you when someone scored a touch. And I remember the guy told me a couple weeks ago, we kept scoring these simultaneous touches, and he kept getting the point. The guy is like, "Hey, man, you're not showing the ref that this is your point. Like, you're not really leaning in and
Mm.
performing all the steps, because there's an objective side and there's a subjective side. Was his essential point, and I'm wondering where that happens because as when you're learning to do it, you also got to learn the ref.
Absolutely.
So at first your head's gonna spin. You got to put the training wheels on you, but you get better with the repetition. So I'd like to know as far as from the coach's perspective, okay, how do I coach these guys to, coach my team members to show a judge or whomever that this is the most compelling argument? How do I shut down? How do I do the opposite for the other team? And even when you put yourself into the judge's shoes, what what are you looking for in a compelling argument? Like there's certain things that they're looking for between touches.
Yeah, absolutely. And to answer that question broadly, I think one of the very first important steps that a debater has to take to expand or increase their ability to speak to certain judges is almost like a suspension of their own ego,
Mm,
right? I think when a person first gets started in debate, they are only able to think about their opponents and their opponents' arguments and their arguments through a very narrow window of here's how I see the issue, here's what I believe I need to say or sound like to sound very cool and persuasive to this judge.
mhm,
I think that something that I would always encourage my debaters to do as early as possible, once they understand the fundamentals of debate, is go judge some lower level debates. Or, if we're talking about college students, go judge high school,
mm,
which there are plenty of opportunities to do, especially if you have experience. They're always looking for people to judge in local high school circuits. So I'll send my students, just on a weekend, I'll say, like, hey, go judge this high school tournament on a Saturday. And you would be surprised about how quickly, once they are in the judge's seat themselves in a different debate, their ability to just sort of understand, it's like, okay, let me think about things more broadly. It's not just about what I think is a very persuasive argument or what I think makes me look very smart and persuasive. Instead, you see all of the mistakes that other people make, what they do well, what they don't do well, and just almost like in any skill, you borrow what works and you leave what doesn't. So throughout that process, they'll learn various rhetorical techniques, that can be very persuasive, but also just how to conduct themselves, sort of like what does a debater sound like? What does a debater
Mm,
look like? How do they handle, very direct confrontation, right? And then through the slow buildup of uh, the knowledge about how to present yourself as a debater and sort of gain your voice, to use the cliche, everything else falls into place after that.
mm. So I got two more for you here as we sort of arrive towards the end. The number one, we had on here public versus academic versus policy debate. We also talked a little bit about presidential debates and how those are kind of a different animal. The time limitations, the stakes. Sort of the frankly an added emotional element. How would you remake the? Well, first of all, give us a little bit of the nuances between the different types of debate, and then tell us how would you remake this into something that is perhaps more productive, more compelling in the sense that it gives you more information with which to make a political decision, and how it and how also especially it reveals I guess character, for lack of a better term, the nerve, the verbal dexterity, the ability to think on one's feet, the ability to swat off a potentially stressful situation. Um, give me a little bit about how you would remake that and how you would evaluate sort of the key elements of what the outcomes of that would be.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's sort of as a,
Oh, by the way, not just presidential, governor,
yeah, yeah,
Senate, the House, whatever.
I'm picking up what you're putting down. It's as a scholar of argumentation, debate professional, whatever title like that sounds cool, I want to give myself. One thing that I always struggle.
Both of those are going in the description of this, by the way.
Thank you. One thing that I really struggle with when trying to explain what I do to people and help them understand the importance of it, help them be able to visualize what it is, most people's conception about what a debate is, in my opinion, is wrong, because all that you see are the presidential debates. All you see is the, social commentary on Fox News or CNN, of like, just four talking heads in boxes, and I just don't think that's an accurate reflection of what debate, at the very least, can be. Should maybe is a little bit too, prescriptive, but debate at the academic level is a very fantastic activity. One distinction is very technical. It's oriented toward, as best as possible, you can never fully suspend your bias or just look at arguments in a vacuum, but
Mhm.
to whatever degree you can, just sort of like looking at the presentation and construction of arguments as their own, almost as an art form. So
Mm,
when I hear a debate speech, it's not about, at least I'm not immediately trying to criticize or evaluate the quality of the arguments contained. I'm looking at the speech's construction. Like, is it using an effective buildup of information? Is it, is as you build that information, are you reaching logical conclusions based upon that? And then when the speech is over, I look at everything that I've heard and consumed and I say, like, okay, is this an overall strong argument? And, most, because debaters have coaches and various people helping them, usually it is. And as a debate goes, debaters in the, collegiate academic form, they're relying upon a judge that has buy-in, that
mm,
is interested, that's taking notes, that's paying attention. Unfortunately, when it comes to presidential debates or, any sort of public debate that is, you know, outside of that academic arena, you're dealing with an audience that's, for totally fine, just doesn't have the same degree of buy-in. But that changes your incentive though as a debater, right?
mm.
Now you're not as focused on the technical aspect of, is this the strongest version of the argument? Rather, is this the most attention grabbing version of the argument?
Right.
Is this something that is salient that will stick with you, you know? And, providing a very strong argument does that. But then again, you know, appeals to emotion just are proven to be the most effective way to grab attention and uh, the sort of argumentation that sits with the audience longest. So when we talk about this distinction between presidential or other type formats of debate versus academic, one thing you have to consider is the audience. If I were to change presidential debates, I would get rid of the audience altogether. There's like no audience. It's just the moderators, facilitators, and the candidates. I think that would be one very important change to sort of like get rid of the grandstanding and, the ways in which an audience can change,
That
what
like,
is
yeah.
could be a nonsense argument, but then the crowd goes wild. What did Trump say to Hillary in the 2016 debate? He said, Hillary said something and then Trump says, you should be in jail. And the crowd goes
Yeah,
wild.
the
I'll admit, that was very funny. Like, but
the
was it
comedic
a
time
good
was there.
point? Was it a great argument? Absolutely not. But those are the sort of things that stick with an audience and why people say X person won this debate. And then you go, why? And they'll just like mention a single line that they said. It was like, this debate took place for a long time. Okay, another change I would make, an important thing is, you know, a lot of these discussions online or presidential debates, they cover so many complex topics in such a quick period of time.
Mhm.
I think it's important to have more long form discussions on complex issues. So, the same way, say maybe 3 presidential debates happen in a campaign season, maybe have people vote on what policy issues are most important to them. And by the first one down, the debate is on that one issue. We're not going to bring, questions of immigration into the same discussion as
Whom allegedly ate whose dog or cat.
yeah, exactly. Or like, healthcare, it's like there's obviously overlap between a lot of policy issues. So keeping them entirely separated is probably not possible. But to whatever degree you can, trying to separate political issues and having people have long form discussions about them is key. But then the final challenge, and I don't know what I would do to change this, is sort of like you said, the question of arguing in good faith versus arguing in bad faith.
Mm.
I think this isn't something that you get from collegiate debate because it's a competitive activity, the same way a presidential campaign is competitive. And even to the degree whenever you see a commentator on any sort of media channel,
Mm.
they have, some sort of perspective that they are pushing, that they
Yeah.
would not be quick to say, I'm wrong on this.
Right.
But through having a background in a relationship to argumentation, to where you don't see it as something that is inherently destructive or toxic, it creates an ability to uh, just think about arguments and engage with them with the people that you know and care about in a way that is so constructive and so positive that you understand what a good faith argument looks like versus a bad faith one. And unfortunately, I think people are only ever exposed to bad faith arguments to
Yeah.
where they just like, I don't even fault anyone. Like, you don't know what it is like to see two people that are genuinely trying to understand an issue and open to the possibility that they're wrong. It's a very beautiful thing. Like, a lot of my friends also have a debate background. We go at each other. We argue like absolutely, like, you ever seen like two feral cats just go
You
at
know?
each other? Like,
Yeah.
we get into it, but it's always informed by, I'm going at my friends hard because I respect them. I
Mm.
respect them so much that I'm going to press them as hard as I can. But also because I respect them, I know I could just end up being wrong. Like, it's like the boxing match. Like, you run at someone, you might get counterpunched, put out. So when those arguments happen, like, I have that in mind. So there are times where I just back off and I say, like, okay, you've answered all of my points. Sometimes I won't say I'm wrong, but I'll just say, like, okay, you've made your position clear and it makes sense. Sometimes I'll just say I'm wrong, right? And then through that, our relationship is stronger, but we are all better intellectuals as a result of it. And I just feel that far too many people don't get the chance to have those kinds of discussions.
I have this bad habit of every time I'm getting to the end, I'll be like, okay, I'll tell my guest to be like, okay, 2 more. And they'll be like, well, I just started one. So there was I guess this is rather brief. There was a guy, I believe he's a journalist. He's created an AI tool and he's been sort of loading in different public figure speeches, Fed chair speeches, Senate, candidates, campaign speeches, whatever. And he the AI has been ranking them on a spectrum, a 50 to 100 spectrum of orality versus tonality. Orality essentially, uh, I think there's more of a lucidity. There's more of a lucidity of cadence. There's a wider word choice. There is less repetition of particular words, and this essentially makes takes the compelling nature of the speech up. And on the tonality side, it's the drawls, it's the inflections, it's the flair, it's the emotional candor, it's all the sort of accoutrements to speech, and that makes it compelling. If you're coaching a debater, where are you trying to get them to fall on that spectrum?
Okay, so
40% here, 30 here, where you or yeah.
as you said that, that actually brought to mind a movie that I like very much. It's called, oh, I'm blanking on that. I want to say it's Speak to Me or something along those lines. It's a
Sounds familiar.
movie about policy debate specifically.
I will watch it
And
tonight.
the two main characters, it's exactly what you just said. There are two main characters. There's policies and activity where two partnerships, it's like two versus two.
Mm.
So there's a guy who has that southern flair. He speaks with the drawl.
Yeah, yeah,
He's
yeah.
very like a very pathos heavy speaker and like,
It's got the Frank Underwood tools.
yeah, a little bit, a little bit. And, his debate partner, who's a woman who's more on the technical side, like I mentioned before. She's all about doing line by line, as we call it in debate, making sure that you're effectively clashing with your opponent's arguments,
Mm.
right? And they're sort of like unpacking the differences between those two styles and how it reveals differences in their character. Like you mentioned before, the way that you think about arguments and the way that you present yourself and the way that you handle those situations, it speaks not just to what you think is persuasive, but also to the way that you relate to other people.
Mm.
I think that someone that has, that special flair, that it factor to them and how they talk, they just relate to the world a little bit differently because when you, can talk yourself out of hard situations, not really with using facts or clash, but just because you have the charisma or you have, just something, it creates a little bit of nebulousness to the world where it's just sort of like, okay, bad things can happen, but I can find a way out.
Mm.
Versus when you're the more technical, high precision person, it's, things aren't nebulous. It's like ABC leads to DEF or something like that.
Mm.
Numbers would have been better than letters, but you get what I'm saying, you know? And I think that both of those things they need to be cultivated,
Mhm.
uh, but also, to whatever degree trying to develop the opposite. And I think when I work with students, it's very quick to identify who falls in which camp. So you want to try to develop that. If you're a very high precision technical person, I want to teach you to get better at that. But also we have to fill that gap to where I need to make you a more persuasive orator
Got
in addition
a little
to,
swagger in.
a very quick thinker
Yeah.
and high precision person. And the exact opposite for the person. And this reminds me, because going back to my story about JMU and our best debates, the best season in the university's history, our best two students were exactly that. I had a student named Eric who was very mild mannered, very shy kind of kid.
Mhm.
He just sort of wandered onto the debate team, didn't really know what he was getting into, but he was, smart as a tack or sharp as a tack, very quickly able to understand information. And then I had another kid named Adonis. Adonis was from New York, the New York accent, and he, it wasn't necessarily about the information processing for him. It was just the ability to speak authentically and to call BS when he hears it.
Mm.
And we put those two together as a partnership, and it was the exact same thing. It's like those two fed off of each other. They learned from each other. And by the end, I mean, we had the most successful season in the university's history, but that was on the back of the most successful partnership in the university and like kind of maybe all of college policy debate, the most successful first year partnership.
Fantastic.
So, I mean, that's just what you're doing as a coach. You're looking for those opportunities for where are you strong? How can I develop that? And how can I fill that gap? So by making you better or by putting you with someone who fills that gap for you.
Oh, man. And my last one, I just wanna, were there any arguments, any situations that just particularly tripped you up? Were there any particular topics, any particular, line of argument that was just really difficult for you personally, or you as a or for the team, something that tripped you up, something that might have taken a little bit more to get the better of?
Um, I would say for me personally, the thing about debate is like it's so broad. You talk about so many different issues. And for me personally, coming from my background, I was a student of economics. I had always considered myself more of a quant person rather than, qualitative or humanities focused. So when I first got into debate and we started debating about social issues that extend beyond just like the hard numbers or facts of
Hmm.
the economy or things like that, discussing very important topics of, race, oppression based upon gender and sexuality. Those things, those conversations were tough for me, not even because I had bad takes on those things, in my opinion, but just because I didn't necessarily know how to engage.
Mm.
But I think that's another very important thing that debate imparts upon students is how to sit in discomfort, but then through that discomfort and those uncomfortable sometimes discussions, uh, how to exist in them, right? And how to express yourself and express whatever point you're trying to make, but still in a very respectful way that is rooted in empathy.
Fantastic, fantastic. Ian Lowry, I want to thank you very much for sitting down to speak to me here today on the Money and Breakfast podcast. We appreciate you being here. Feel free to grab a LaCroix and a gift bag.
Thank you very much, Mike. It's been an honor.